Thank you very much for coming. First of all, it's a great honor and pleasure to be here. It's a glorious campus. It's a very good university. So those of you who got into the university amongst the students present, you can already be very proud of yourselves. San Diego's a wonderful town, so in every way you hit the jackpot. I think that also goes for the faculty, by the way, and so I'm delighted to be amongst you for a week. I did come a couple of times before to San Diego, but both times for conferences, and somehow I saw nothing of the city. But thanks to Greg and others here at the university, I've seen a lot more of it, and it's clear that you're all very fortunate to be here. On the two coming speakers, both will be very interesting. Estonia is on the front lines with the Russian Federation and has had a fairly contentious relationship with it since its independence. So I think both on Ukraine, but more generally on the neighborhood of the Russian Federation, he'll be fascinating, as well as the topic that he'll be addressing. And I know of the Filipina journalist who's coming. She's very well known in Asia as an exceptionally courageous journalist, so I'm sure she'll be fantastic. So I'm sorry I'll miss both of those. Now, my topic today, there's so many ways of thinking about the development of countries. And every country has a unique development track shaped by geography, by history, by populations that make up the country. So probably there are as many conceptions of international development as there are people who have given the topic some thought. I was fortunate because my parents took me to the developing world when I was quite young. When I was 8, we went to live in Iran, and we were there nearly 5 years. They were very good years for Iran, a country that hasn't had all that many good years for quite a long time. And after that, they went to Nigeria at a time the country was in civil war. And that acquainted my siblings and me with the harsh realities of much of the world, that conflicts break out easily, but they're actually usually quite difficult to bring to an end, or to bring to an end that satisfies any of the belligerents. Now, what we think of as international development today probably dates back to only about 1950 or so, because so much of the world was still colonized until after the Second World War. And it was an American who decided that both it was in America's interest, but also it was the right thing to do, to put a lot of pressure on the colonial powers to start decolonizing. And that president was Roosevelt, and Truman followed up quite energetically on this particular vector of Roosevelt's very capacious worldview. And so the idea of supporting countries that were coming out of colonial status really only became relevant after the Second World War. Institutions that we today associate with the development process, including the World Bank, weren't actually created to help the developing world. They were created with a mandate that lends itself to helping the developing world, but that wasn't the first priority when it was created at all. The first priority was reconstruction after the Second World War, which in many cases didn't so much involve the developing continents of the world. So a slow retooling around decolonization occurred from about 1950 onwards, and we're still perhaps early in the process of developing countries making their own way as fully independent entities in the international system. Development programming didn't really exist until the early 50s. The first significant development project was something called the Colombo Plan. What was the Colombo Plan? It was simply a massive plan to provide food aid to a number of countries in South Asia. So the British left South Asia in a disastrous position. They left precipitately. They had no particular plan for how these countries would survive. Decolonizing was the right thing to do, but it might have been nice to have a plan for what was to follow, and they didn't. Fortunately, in some countries, the leadership was very strong. In India, there was a remarkable prime minister called Nehru. In fact, India produced probably 2 of the 10 greatest 20th century figures, Gandhi and Nehru, who worked together very closely until Gandhi's death. But others were not so lucky, and crops failed, and the idea was by countries that had grain surpluses to recycle these grain surpluses to these countries in great need. So you can imagine who those countries were, or which they were: Australia, the United States, Canada, for all I know, Argentina participated also. It was countries with surpluses anyway. And so it just seemed a very sensible thing to do, rather than having grain rotting in silos, to provide it to those in hunger. But it was a very new idea, actually, that only came to seem commonplace subsequently. Then what happened after the Colombo Plan was a lot of experimentation in the developing world. So it wasn't large-scale development assistance. It was what could make countries themselves more productive. So various experiments were conducted in countries like India, Kenya, some Latin American countries that were poorer also, on how countries could themselves become richer simply by adopting certain technologies that had been tried and proven to work, or a different approach to agriculture in this or that part of the country, a different approach to water distribution, these sorts of things. But it was all very experimental. There was no sense that the UN or anybody else knew how development should be done in the 1950s. And it made it an extraordinarily rich decade for the future of development, because it was experimental, no certainties. And one problem since then is development has often become rather ideological, rather political, and not necessarily particularly evidence-based in programming. So we owe a great deal to the 1950s, although very few people have charted what was going on experimentally in countries like Mexico, India, these experiments were pregnant with possibilities that were capitalized on later, both by the countries involved, but also more generally by the international community. And the World Bank and the IMF, because Europe recovered so much faster from the Second World War than had been anticipated, all of a sudden might have gone out of business if they hadn't, as most organizations want to do if they're in difficulty, changed their mission. So their mission became progressively in the late 50s, early 60s, well, how could we help with this development dilemma in much of the world? And it was a complete retooling, notably for the World Bank, from one type of work to a completely different type of work. And lots of new institutions were springing up, multilateral institutions. At first, the bank and the fund were the big multilateral funders, but eventually there were also regional development banks, some of which actually were able to marshal very considerable sums of money, which proved helpful in the development process. But none of this was carefully planned. When we look back at all, we imagine it must have been somehow carefully planned, but most of it was trial and error, including in the 50s, and a lot of it was just improvisation in order to help these newly independent countries who had been rushed to independence, in large part because they wanted to be independent as fast as possible, to prosper. And that's all within the lifetime of a number of people who are still alive, I should say. The great Indian development economist Amartya Sen, a Nobel Prize winner, lived through all of this in his lifespan, which is why he, by the way, is a fantastically interesting speaker, because his human experience of development is even more interesting than his academic experience of development. The process of decolonization really accelerated, as I mentioned early on. A few independent countries existed, Thailand, for example, in Asia, but not many. Ethiopia in Africa. Both Africa and Asia had been pretty thoroughly colonized, either militarily or economically, one way or the other, colonized. Latin America, on the other hand, had decolonized itself quite early on, but shared many of the challenges, or many of the countries of Latin America shared problems with Africa and Asia rather than the problems of Europe and, say, North America. So the world became rather divided in that way between an industrialized North, as it was sometimes called, and a developing South, the global South, it was often called. Although there's huge differentiation within the global South, nevertheless, that's how it came to be rather lazily identified. There was a very interesting figure I thought I'd mention because he's a bit forgotten and shouldn't be forgotten, an Argentinian man called Raúl Prebisch, who served in the central bank of his country as a young man. He was a brilliant young economist, did a variety of things, but increasingly came to believe that Latin America was a systematic loser in its economic relations with both Europe and the United States, because Latin America was dependent on the markets of the United States, Canada, and Europe to survive. It was providing inputs to those markets, but it wasn't providing finished products. So it was condemned forever to be just a provider of inputs. And this was an insight that was barely registered at the time. And what made it register much more, this what he called dependency theory, was that he became the senior UN official for Latin America. He was head of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and that gave him an international platform to develop some of these themes. And a bit later, he became the head of the UN Conference on Trade and Development. He died quite young, which is one reason that perhaps we don't remember him as much as we should, but a lot of his thinking is fundamental to thinking about development today, and yet he is largely forgotten. So I thought I'd mention him. There was a fantastic biography of him about 10 years ago. It turned out he was a bigamist, and he was a son of a bigamist also. So his private life was just as interesting as his public life. The 1960s were marked very much by an increasingly fierce phase of the Cold War between East and West. And East and West started competing for the developing world. So if you were, say, Nigeria, you'd have Soviet delegations turning up. What can we do for you? What would you like? Would you like a dam? Would you like a railway line? And the United States was doing exactly the same, and so were US allies. And so there was intense competition to win over developing countries to one's ideological view and to a sort of relationship of, if more than friendship, let's say, a more substantive relationship. Now, some of these projects were gifts, but many of them involved loans. And the newly developed developing countries had very little sense as governments of what loans involved, that if you accumulated too much borrowing, there was going to be a problem at some point. At that stage, the governments were just desperate to get economies going. And so many of them unwisely got very heavily indebted. And much of the development track since then, since the 60s and early 70s, has been about how to manage debt. There have been debt crises, and I'll come back to the most spectacular of them, and what some of the efforts were to help developing countries overcome debt. There was a sense in the developing world that they were owed a lot more than the aid they were getting. And depending on how you think about these things, that could be absolutely right in absolute terms. The aid effort of no country has gone much above 1% of the total national budget, which means that not huge sums of money were flowing to development. And much of what was flowing was actually subsidization of loans that needed to be repaid eventually, either to a regional development bank, the IMF, somebody else. So the efforts of the industrialized world to help support the developing world were always fairly modest in truth. And particularly when you consider how much the colonial powers had benefited from colonization for a very long time. It became clear in the late 1970s that a debt crisis was beginning to take shape. And it was beginning to be discussed quite a lot. How do we help developing countries before it becomes a crisis? And this issue was discussed in a variety of international forums, the UN, annual meetings of the World Bank, regional development banks as well, but pretty inconclusive. And then two political figures who happened to be very like-minded, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher of Britain, happened to be in power at the same time, And at a meeting in 1981 of about 25 leaders of countries from developing and developed countries, they just said, listen, there's going to be no debt forgiveness. There's going to be nothing. We owe you nothing. What we do, we do out of the goodness of our hearts. So get over it. And this actually preceded the debt crisis getting worse, of course, which it did steadily throughout the 1980s. And in that period, the World Bank and the IMF, influenced by Ronald Thatcherism, I think of it, decided to actually administer tough love to developing countries. It was called structural adjustment. You either do what we say or there's going to be no money. And their recipes were often much too radical. These were people based in Washington, although some of them had served in the developing world, designing programs for countries they knew very little about. And the results were very bad by the end of the 1980s. And that the bank and the fund had to come face to face with, that their policies during the 80s had been catastrophic. It was helpful in a way. It wasn't helpful to developing countries, of course, but it was helpful intellectually because what the absolute bankruptcy of that approach was universally recognized, and that was helpful. So subsequently, approaches to funding of developing countries, to development itself, how countries best develop themselves, all of this became more flexible, there was much less certainty, a renewed interest in a degree of experimentation and understanding that countries aren't alike. Each country is singular in its own way. So having, the same recipe for all is unlikely to provide gratifying results. And this new way of thinking, I'd say, marked the second half of the 1990s. And then what happened in the year 2000 was very much influenced by thinking in the United States, thinking around goal-oriented organization of work and life. So in the very late 90s, the UN started debating perhaps an approach of not telling countries what to do, but setting some overall goals that applied to pretty well all countries, which is where the Millennium Development Goals came from. They ran for 15 years, from the year 2000 to 2015. There were 8 goals, a little over 20 targets, but very specific targets of what countries would be trying to reach, and indicators whereby the achievement or not of the targets could be measured. Believe it or not, most of the goals were achieved. Now that was partly because, for reasons we still don't understand fully, growth all over the world accelerated, but particularly in the developing world, between about the year 2000 and 2015. The Millennium Development Goals may have contributed somewhat to that, but nobody actually has come up with a very good explanation of why growth accelerated during those years. But it accelerated enough that, for example, in Africa, a number of countries for which had seemed to themselves to be moving backwards constantly, all of a sudden seemed to themselves to be moving forward. So that was very new and very hopeful. Unfortunately, this growth spurt in the global economy, particularly affecting the developing world, although Latin America less than Africa and Asia, came to an end roughly at the time the Millennium Development Goals came to an end. We didn't know it at the time. At the time, what the UN was busy doing was coming up with much more ambitious, much more numerous sustainable development goals, the SDGs, which were launched in 2015. Many of you will have seen a very colorful pin that symbolizes the Millennium Development Goals. It was not the product of experts. It was the product of a diplomatic negotiation at the United Nations. And diplomatic negotiations at the UN are very much give and take, but the easiest thing is to give in to opponents as long as you get something else in return. The result was, instead of 8 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals involved 17 goals. All of them made sense, by the way, but 17 goals is a lot for a government to deal with. Somewhat less manageable, over 150 targets, in fact, completely unmanageable by any government, and indicators running into the 200s. So the package was a totally bloated package that no government, not of the richest country in the world, certainly not for countries of limited means, could manage. So it was very well intentioned. It had intellectual integrity, but it turned out to have rather limited practical applicability because the capacity of governments is limited, even in the richest countries. It was meant to apply to the industrialized world as well as the developing world, but the industrialized world did nothing much about it, considering these goals were, after all, mainly for the developing countries. Some of the industrialized countries adopted an internal approach to the goals also, but very few. Because growth slowed down, perhaps also because the Millennium Development Goals were so complex, they were very difficult for governments to internalize, work with constructively. Growth slowed down, but it's still a mystery, actually, why growth slowed down after 2015. And that was a heavy blow to attainment of the goals. A much worse blow, of course, was the pandemic, because while those of us living in industrialized countries or from industrialized countries were seriously inconvenienced by the pandemic, for developing countries, particularly in Africa, parts of Asia, it was an absolute disaster and knocked the economies back quite a way. And this was in the case of developing but fragile economies to begin with. So we're way off track, the Sustainable Development Goals now. The objective surely must be in a practical way rather than in a diplomatic way or an ideological way, seeing how developing countries can be helped actively to get back on their feet in terms of their own international trade, in terms of their economies. Unfortunately, several countries that have been major donors have walked away from their aid programs or walked away from the level their aid programs had reached before the pandemic. So it looks likely that while overall aid flows might have been about $175, $180 billion last year, it's likely to be somewhat less in the future at exactly the time when somewhat more would be the right thing to do. So I don't leave you with particularly glad tidings on my subject, but it's not because the news is bad that it should be ignored. On the contrary, bad news needs to be confronted and something needs to be done about it. And it's your generation, probably, who will wind up doing something about it in the countries that you come from. And that's why I didn't want to give you a sugar-coated account of the development process. I hope I did say at the beginning that it's a very personal one. I'm not speaking for the UN. I'm not speaking for my own institution. I always speak publicly only on my own behalf. And I hope many of you from developing countries, but also other students and academics of the university will wind up working in developing countries, contributing to developing countries in the many ways any of us could in our lifetimes. And I think I'll stop there now, and we'll have a conversation, I hope. So thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating and a pleasure for me to listen. I'm going to start us off with one question and then open it up, so I hope everyone's ready. Your intro on the kind of first years of international development was fascinating to me. And you brought up, of course, Roosevelt as a driver of that. To what extent do you think the movements within developing countries to push for independence were encouraged by Roosevelt or drove Roosevelt? Do you have a sense of which direction that went?
I don't think they drove Roosevelt. I think probably there were several motivations. Roosevelt was a brilliant man and a very complex thinker, so a very capacious mind. I think one thing he was sick of was the inbuilt advantage of colonial powers that were competing with the United States on the backs of their colonies. Now, the US had been fairly colonial in Latin America and Central America, but never formally colonial, or not recently formally colonial. There was the Philippines, of course. But so I think there was the competitive advantage of these countries that had been bailed out completely by the US in the Second World War. The thought of them going back to having these unfair advantages, I think, may have been there. But I also think he had a very generous side of his thinking also, which was, you know, why should these countries be enslaved? The US was enslaved to Britain. We didn't like it. Why should these others be putting up with it? So probably quite complex. He was a very complex man. The US was very lucky to have that particular president at that particular time for so long. And the world was very lucky to have Roosevelt because his vision for the post-war settlement was a generous vision. It wasn't to punish Germany, Japan, Italy, and other enemies during the war. It was to help them back on their feet as quickly as possible so they would never be vengeful again. And so I think, you know, Roosevelt was one of the truly great figures of the 20th century.
Awesome. Thank you. Do we have any audience questions? We have one here.
So I was struck by the mention of the great competition between the former Soviet Union and the US in development space and how that foreshadows a maybe less great competition that's going on at the moment between the US and China in development circles. And I wonder, and I'm struck by at least one fundamental difference, and that is the world is much more globalized than it was in 1950-something or 60-something. And so I wonder if you could comment a little bit about, I guess, the parallels you see between that competition and what might be different vis-a-vis a more globalized world, or anything else you see from your vantage point.
Well, I didn't speak at all about China, and of course it is a country that developed itself after the death of Mao Zedong at an absolutely frantic rate, never before known in history, over a period of 35 years. And, thoroughly admirable that the country was able to do this, and that the leadership, communist leadership, was willing to be experimental rather than very top-down on how the development track was going to work. I think what we have now is something new in China. It's so new that it's very difficult to know how to interpret it, in fact. And one result of it, and also China's response to the pandemic, which was similar in some ways to Japan's response to the pandemic, which was just shut ourselves off from the world. It wasn't good economically for either country, but China's less far down the development track than Japan. So in that sense, relatively, it's probably been a more severe experience for China, and it continues for China while Japan's reopening at long last. We don't know what the intentions of Chairman Xi are, very opaque. We know that China's military capabilities are much greater than would have been the case when Deng Xiaoping became the sort of maximum leader of China in 1978 or 79. But that doesn't mean it's a good idea to use them. In fact, as far as I can make out, the last serious conflict China engaged in was with Vietnam in 1979, and Vietnam actually administered a very bloody nose to China. That was a reminder that when people are fighting for their own country, they can find an energy and a how can I say, a collective will that hadn't been noticed before. Ukraine is an example of that at the moment. If you ask people about Ukraine 3 years ago, corrupt former Soviet republic would have been the answer. That's not the answer today. I certainly hope we don't go into a second world war because it doesn't seem to me that either side of another Cold War will gain. And I suspect Washington would prefer not to enter into a full-blown second Cold War also. But what the intentions are in China, very hard to know because everything depends on one man, much more than it has since Mao Zedong, in effect, and his Prime Minister, Zhou Enlai. At least there were two of them, and they were rather different men. With the current chairman, it's one person who is running the show. So it's a bit worrying in Asia, but it probably would be in China's interest to focus again on its economy for the next 30 years because wars are unpredictable, conflict is unpredictable, it's expensive, and consequently, very, very risky for all involved.
Mark?
So following up on Josh, there's another episode after the 50s and 60s that you pointed out, the debt episodes, the strong indebtedness of the developing countries. And you lay blame on the global north, as you call it, for having pursued somewhat restrictive measures. What puzzles me for a while now, and in your remarks I came back to thinking about it, there was an example of a developing country in the 1800s, also a former colony, got a lot of foreign debt from its former colonizer, built its canals and railroads on that money, and developed and repaid without a crisis. Yes. And I think, so that's the United States. By the way, there's still Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, so speaking of colonies and colonizers. The reason I wonder so much about that contrast is there's now a new wave of indebtedness in the developing world with not a former colonizer, but with China. And also on maybe tougher repayment terms than it initially appeared. So perhaps that contrast between the United States as a developing country in the 19th century and the experience of the debt crisis in the 20th can be illuminating. And I just am curious to hear what you think.
Well, I think you're quite right. And we don't know how the story ends with the sort of Belt and Road lending, as well as some of it is gift, but a lot of it is lending. How it ends for countries in Africa and in Asia particularly, but even Latin America too. What seems unlikely is that China will be able to recuperate all of its money, but it does create a debt trap for a number of countries in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. How China and these countries come to deal with that is unknowable so far. China, during the pandemic, was quite flexible in the cases that I followed about repayment and so on. But whether that will last, whether more reciprocation from developing countries will be demanded, if not in repayment, then in other forms, leasing of land, for example. We don't know yet, but it's a complex program and it varies from country to country. And in many ways, I think it has alienated not so much governments from China, but it's alienated a number of populations from China. The knowledge that their country is in debt now to this country for things that haven't benefited them at all. So the public may have been very happy to see a football stadium go up, but if industrial farming is going on for the benefit of China in the country with Chinese workers, Chinese managers, and the country is in no way benefiting from that, that is going to generate a lot of ill will. So it's something both sides in the equation need to be thinking about. Whether they are, I don't know.
To follow up on Mark's question, why do you think, I guess one part of his question was why was the US able to repay its debt and the post-colonial countries in the 50s and 60s and 70s had a harder time?
Well, I think the developing countries, particularly perhaps in Africa, a country like India or Pakistan always had considerable potential. It had just been impoverished tremendously during the colonial period. There was some very interesting work in the OECD in the early 90s by some British scholars that calculated that in 1750, China's economic production was equal to about 25% of global economic production. India is perhaps somewhere between 17 and 22% of global production. The process of complete colonization of India and somewhat economic colonization of China and the various episodes of the 19th century involving colonial powers in China left both countries by the year 1950 at a level of global production drastically lower. So in the case of China, probably it accounted for somewhere between 2.5% and 3% of global production by 1950. India, somewhere between 1.7 and 2.2% of the world's production. And in the immediate post-colonial period, India became even poorer. It took about 20 years until that ratio started climbing for India again. So I think the colonial or semi-colonial, in the case of China, experience was a truly devastating one for countries. It lasted a very long time in the case of India. And there are some positives to show for it, which the British are always pleased to tell us about, and the French too, but frankly, not very convincing compared to the downsides of colonization for the countries involved, in my view.
We have a couple of questions back here. Oh, we have time for one more, so sorry.
Reference China. I read an article that suggested that they weren't particularly interested in these loans being repaid as much as the possibility of confiscating these properties, whether it's a bridge, a railroad station, or a field of food, because if any civil unrest or border unrest came up, they then had a vested interest they could go and defend because it was actually their property that was being attacked.
I think that that's a possibility, but it affects very little of the debt globally, because you're assuming that the debt is infrastructure contiguous to China or close to China. In fact, a great deal of the debt is owed by countries a very long way from China. Africa, but Latin America also, you know, it's quite alarming when you look at the debt figures of some countries like Ecuador towards China. So I think there are a mix of motivations in the case of China. It was a developing country. It is a developing country. I'm sure there is a sense of some solidarity with other developing countries. But as you point out, there may also be strategic objectives in the program. I think just as human beings are complicated, countries are complicated too in their motivations. So what you raise, I think, is very pertinent to a lot of the thinking both inside China and outside China about the Belt and Road and various other programs. Belt and Road is being downplayed at the moment, and some other programs that Beijing has initiated are being played up a bit more at the moment. But I would say that the Chinese aid in Africa was very welcome when it came. And it took a while before populations, particularly, rather than governments, realized there might be a considerable downside to it. China may, for example, choose to forgive all of the debt of developing countries further to Belt and Road projects, but it hasn't articulated anything like that yet. There's going to be growing pressure on it to articulate something like that in years ahead, I imagine, but we'll see. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Please stay. We have a reception for the next half hour. There's food, and we can talk some more. Thanks.